policy. The aim of equity and inclusion is now at the heart of the National Education Policy 2020. The policy brings in the social dimension to education and aims to ensure equity and inclusion in and through education by addressing all forms of exclusion and marginalization. The policy focuses on the concept of leaving no one behind, a crucial step forward to strengthen our higher education system and the society we live in. So this plenary session will have deliberations with an emphasis on two critical facets of equity and inclusion. Number one, what are the best institutional practices and interventions that we can bring about in order to have equity, diversity and inclusion in higher education institutions? The second dimension would be about how can institutions ensure inclusive curriculum apart from just offering an inclusive infrastructure. So we will have deliberations and points of view shared by the both eminent key speakers. After the session, the floor will be open for Q&A. May I now request Dr. Sharath Ananthamurthy to kindly take over the session. Over to you, sir.
So, first of all, I'd like to express my thanks to the organizers. I've been associated with CESS in informal ways, more as a long-time friend and colleague of Professor Sridhar. So when I got this invitation by Gaurish, I was a little taken aback. Well, I'm a physics professor and I teach and research in physics. Although, as all citizens should be, I'm deeply interested and concerned with these issues that are so central to our institutions, but only as an outsider, really. So I was wondering why I've been asked. And then it suddenly occurred to me that Professor Sridhar and I used to be sort of sparring friends. We discussed, argued, fought, disagreed quite a bit. But in the end, I would always come away having learned something, having acquired a new perspective. And so I dearly miss him today, because when I prepared this talk, you always think about things, but you have an audience in mind. So there were two. One is my own wife, but I'm happy she's not here today, because she would have nitpicked on every little thing that I said and completely decimated my thoughts. In the right direction, of course. But more importantly, Professor Sridhar. So I really think that he was sort of holding out something to me and saying, hey, let's see if you can talk about this. So I'll try and live up to his expectation. I'm sure he'll get a version of what I've been saying. So what I'd like to do is really to expose myself, because a lot of what I'm going to say is tentative. So it's a thought-forming process. There's an expert here with me who may probably be able to get into the nitty-gritty of this very problematic but essential thing that we would have to ensure. The NEP has stated this as one of the objectives, to design and develop inclusive frameworks, also in curricula as well as in practice. So let me just use the slides sort of more as a way to bring up the kind of things I want to say. So just a little background. So, well, first of all, let's do it a little axiomatically. So I would say that it's not a mutually exclusive thing, but equity and inclusion is a must to ensure excellence. And this may appear contradictory, especially for someone from a STEM background, because I've often heard of and also had dialogues and disagreements with my colleagues who think otherwise, see it as mutually exclusive. It's of course a constitutional obligation on our part, and that is based on the principle of equity. Well, yesterday we heard analogous arguments made on this, but I would also extend it to the issue of inclusiveness and equity, that diversity brings better health to an organization. And I would say that this also brings a more robust and a more dynamic and creative environment to our education institutions. So, of course, it also is in adherence to the way in which we evolve through the democratic principles, where it is essential to take into account diverse views, disagree, and come to consensus on many things. So this is an essential aspect of the exercise of democratic principles. Right, and also yesterday again beautifully put by the Toyota man, Mr. Parshuraman, that business has realized, and one always, I personally take the business sense as the most accurate indicator of what's going on, because they have their, feet firmly on the ground. That said that including diversity now is so essential for us to become more competitive. So I see this as a really fresh, innovative view on things. And, this famous thing that you have to cast a net in a big wide lake, and only then is talent going to really be discovered. So I think this is an absolute must, and it's absolutely essential for our institutions to thrive, especially as a democracy. Well, I just quickly, so today my objective is not really to sort of do the run-through of what the statistics is like and establish through those means the need for this. But I want to really go to a more philosophical kind of basis for looking at the motivation and need for E&I, as I call it. So it stands at about 26.3% in 2019, and I think the latest figures is about 27.1. This is from the AISFG document. It's 26.9 for males, and if you divide it, it's slightly better for women. Scheduled castes form 23.4%, STs always as expected, lower, and Muslims are about 16%. Christians and other minorities have done little better than that, but I don't have the numbers. In higher education institutions, though, the situation is still not very good. Scheduled caste students constitute about roughly 15%. STs much lower, at 5.6%. OBCs constitute a larger chunk, of course. The statistics thinks that we are around 50% of the population or more. And again, the minority and Muslims are abysmally low. So let's actually look at this in in terms of several issues that confront us, and as so many of you put it so nicely, the issue of the rural-urban divide, which also is one of the barriers that we need to overcome before we start thinking of inclusive education. So this has already been sort of discussed, to have multidisciplinary institutions where the expertise is shared among various people. You also, the expansion drive, where you make accessibility to people who don't have access by going to them rather than expecting them to come here. And that again is something that has been talked about as part of the expansion and also sharing of expertise. Here I'd like to actually bring about an example that, well, one of the things also was what was discussed yesterday. Professor Sitaram from the IIT Guwahati gave this very nice example where they are mentoring, if you will, another smaller institution with a lot of informal kinds of learning. So this kind of reaching out to take into your fold and mentor it, if you will, also work with it, has to happen much more. So that was a very good example. And talent relocation. Here I'd like to actually share with you an experience that I studied, I did my graduate work at IIT Kanpur, and then I went abroad for a PhD. And of course in the late 80s, the mid 80s, the most guys you would see in the physics department were Chinese. And these students spoke not a word of English, but they were excellent, excellent students. I mean, there are all these very difficult qualifying exams, and they usually aced the exam. So the Indian contingent would be somewhere in between. Now they're doing much better, but the Chinese were always on top. So I happened to befriend a few of them. They were very shy, but they would sometimes talk to us. And they also tended to stick only amongst themselves. One thing they said was about, they were all, depending on how you look at it, either victims of the Cultural Revolution or beneficiaries of this great disaster, really, if you ask me. Mao Zedong's Cultural Revolution in China produced a lot of anguish and terrible things happened. The communists wouldn't agree with that, but one thing that it happened was relocation of talent. They said that some of our best professors in physics were guys who came from Beijing into the far-flung areas. So it was enforced talent relocation, that you've got to go and teach the people who are not, who have been deprived of the benefits of good teaching. So this somehow seems to have helped a lot. And I think we have to take a leaf out of this, to have some sort of talent relocation in terms of improving things. I'd like to come mainly also to another barrier, if you will, and this is the issue of language. And this is so familiar to all my colleagues here who talk about, in every such conference one hears this talk of, all this higher education is in a language which is unfamiliar to their thinking experience. How do we overcome this? Here again, I go back to the China example, because I'm talking in a very limited context from what I've seen. There's a massive translation program there. Almost every classic canon of physics got translated almost instantaneously. Bad translations sometimes, like perhaps more like guidebooks, but they had it. They had Jackson, they had Goldstein. These are all the fathers of modern physics textbooks, and they had it all there. And somehow they were able to negotiate the two languages. So they had learned the skill not of articulating English. My English was always found to be much better than theirs, but their ability to cognize, to start to understand in these languages. And here again, I myself, when I used to teach at Bangalore University, switched to Kannada, which is my language. And I think one should give up the notion that it's impossible if you are teaching a very formal thing. You can't use simple Kannada. I have this idea called Berike Bhashe, where you use the Kannada or whatever. I'm not privileging any particular language here, but you use the language familiar to them to acclimatize them into the situation. Because often an area like physics or mathematics, these are so abstract in their conceptualization. But the first step to abstraction is really to grapple with it in your own terms, in your own understanding. And what better can you do than use the language of their environment? So this idea of trans-languaging, where you move across between the languages in the same environment, I think we have to rethink this in a very serious way, even at the levels of higher education. This is of course done in schools. Odisha apparently is a very good example of these trans-languaging experiments, and it's happening all the time in schools. You can't teach them without, especially if you go to a rural school, without using the language. And why not? Why not? But there's also a more formal thing that needs to be done. This is the absence of good textbooks at higher levels in our own languages. To an extent, and again I'll have to confine myself to physics, in Bangla, Bengalis have done better. They are so proud of their own Bangla that all the best Bengali scientists went and did their work, also a little bit of work in translating some of the best textbooks into Bangla. Apparently Satyendranath Bose, he was such a proud Bengali, S.N. Bose of the Bose-Einstein statistics fame. It's believed to have said, if you can't teach physics in Bangla, it doesn't mean that you don't know Bangla, it means you don't know physics. So I would say that in a metaphorical sense, that it really is the ability to negotiate that space in your own familiar tongue that really tests your understanding. So, but not only that, but when you are bringing the subject into a language, you are also creating a knowledge. You are creating the contexts which are local to the experience of that population. So it's not simply a translation work. One of the things we tried, which hasn't worked out, but because I think we had a wrong choice of textbooks, is there's this undergraduate series in physics called the Berkeley series. It was of course developed from the University of California, Berkeley, a public institution, mind you. And these are outstanding physics textbooks. So we have a translation activity. Azim Premji had supported us. So we have a book there, but it hasn't seen the light of the day. And the reason is for two things. One is Berkeley is a slightly wrong choice for our audience. The second is the language is too Sanskritized. But I would say that the problem is not with Sanskritizing it, because I think Sanskrit is a very advanced language. It's a language developed for scientific thinking. You just have to talk to the computational scientists and they'll tell you what an exact language it is. There's no ambiguity in its expression. So I think that it should happen that all the bhashas should have an easy interaction with Sanskrit, and not that things should be less Sanskritized. So that's my view on things. So of course, these are some of the things that I just like to rush through. One of the things I think is we should think of equity and inclusion in a larger context. So it's not just about SC, ST, but they should go beyond to include all forms of disabilities, minorities, because after all the kind of the backwardness faced by all of them is roughly of the same order. So I think some kind of offices on all campuses. By the way, I must also say that somewhere the NEP talks about private institutions institutionalizing this as a philanthropic contribution. I think I disagree there. I think this should be mandated. Let's give up the notion that inclusion is against merit. Inclusion is better merit. We should have that. So these are absolutely must. Workshops and courses, there's a lot on gender sensitization. I think that has to go across. We are after all a civilized society when we learn to negotiate differences. Different ways of prayer, different cosmologies that we all carry through. And India is a wonderful experiment in that. It's not, we are this continuing civilization because we are able to do that. We should do it with even more zeal. And also, I'd like to say this in the context of state universities. I'm against hostels which are separated. This is, of course, something very dangerous for me to say because I'll probably face big bats. But in the interest of inclusion and equity, I think there should be common hostels. Hostels should be divided only based on gender. They should not be divided on caste. After all, it's the experiment of living together that we need to be demanding and not, because this leads to some sort of ghettoization. So I would also say that in the infrastructure, do away with this. In certain universities, we don't have separate SC/ST hostels. They're all together. Okay? Benefits, depending on the social welfare department, that's a different thing, and that ought to be there. Give them fellowships, funding, but the same facilities. Okay, let me now shift gears a little and actually talk about the context of STEM education, because that's what I'm most familiar with. Here, I want to deal with two things. One is the inclusion of different social groups. The other is the design of pedagogy, because how do we usher in inclusiveness when you're talking about content, about knowledge systems? There is another aspect of inclusiveness there, which is very essential to this. I think, and this is again very tentative, please correct me if I'm wrong, that this is easier done in the humanities than in STEM. Why is that? Because I think science, technology, engineering, and math education is largely derived from what I call is the dominant Western paradigm. I mean, for better or for worse, I may have some differences there. This is the paradigm we negotiate. This is the paradigm we have taken seriously. Here, the very local experiences, the differences, the cosmologies, don't have much of a role to play, because by its very nature, I think STEM subjects are hierarchical in their knowledge content. And the hierarchy places the rational, scientific, secular tradition above all. Okay? So how do we negotiate with that? Whereas this is much easier, say, if you're designing a course in anthropology or in the social sciences, because context matters, local context matters, experience matters. Even the knowledge system that you create could be informed by these very local experiences. So there's a problem there. Okay? So how do we include this knowledge in pedagogy? And here I'd like to go one step further. Well, let me put it this way. The NEP very rightly is talking about a platform where there is scope for indigenous knowledge systems, different ways of experiencing the world, different cosmologies. In that light, here comes a serious difference. One is the science of astrology. Is it a science? Well, if you took the dominant Western scientific rational model, it is not a science. Because one of the cornerstones of a scientific system is that it's subject to critical self-evaluation and correction. There is nothing written in stone in science. The very strength of the Western scientific tradition is its changeability, its adaptability. And there's a famous speaker called Thomas Kuhn who talked about the developments in physics in terms of shifting paradigms. It's not that you move towards more and more truthful positions, but that you work in terms of the paradigms that are defined by the community of scientists. Okay? And in that process, you try and make your theories and your explanations better and better. Okay? But there's no ultimate truth. And there's no scope for the given word here. Because science, by its very nature, questions authority. So, where is the place for putting in these alternative cosmologies? Well, there is another position by a famous philosopher called Paul Feyerabend, who was very radical. If you ask me, he was also a little mad. Who said, let's not even worry about this. Put everything across. There's this very wonderful book called Science in a Free Society, where Paul Feyerabend talks about the place for all kinds of cosmologies. And he sort of advocates a kind of a free market system. He says that, whatever is good survives. But, if you are an educationist, I think, and if you are concerned about what is true, then you can't be doing this exercise. Because after all, the market won't decide what the truth is, in knowledge systems. You have to intervene. The experts have to intervene. So we can't do this way. So I'll end this by saying that there's a problem here. There's a problem which we have to, I think we have to grip the bull by its horns. Because a lot of, so far I've been listening to it, criticality seems to be absent here. People are saying a lot of nice things which the NEP says. The NEP has very good intentions. There's no doubt about it. But let's give it meaning. Let's start looking at after all, to quote a cliche, the devil is in its detail. So I just say that by its very nature, the universal secular scientific, which is what informs modern technology today. There's also convergence of technologies of sort. Today, all over the world, we are thinking of the same things. The knowledge workers that we want to produce in a globalized context, the workers who will negotiate with the higher order cognitive skills. So that is moral, and the NEP's conceptualization gives us a chance to take the bull by its horns. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, sir, for that insightful address. We move on to the second key speaker of the day, Srimati Suparna Diwakar. Ma'am, may I request you to kindly address the gathering.
Namaskara. It's wonderful to be here and to listen to these extremely rich conversations. I want to thank the organizers for having me here and basically to share some thoughts on this whole idea of equity and inclusion, which is a very important chapter in NEP. I will use a few slides just to sort of anchor the conversation. And did you point it there? Yeah. So as is the sort of tradition, I would like to sort of talk a little bit about the context from which I'm speaking today. I play many roles, and the role that I'm speaking from today is largely these. And over here, I would in particular like to point you. So there's a particular word over there which I put in italics called bricolage, right? And in my view, it's a very important part of the roles that I've been playing across all these institutions. And the word bricolage really means trying to bring things together to make sense of them into a whole, right? And so the whole idea of equity and inclusion is really coming from this role that I've been playing as a bricklayer with multiple young people across all of these institutions, right? So I've been teaching, I've been mentoring, I've been supporting students, doing counseling at times, though I'm not a trained counselor. And so I've been actually interacting with these young people. And so a lot of what I'm going to share today is coming from my practice, right? I am what you might call a academic, right? The practitioners think I'm an academician, and the academicians think, oh, she's just a practitioner. So I'm actually coming from that middle space. Now, I particularly like this diagram, right? Because where are we trying to go? We are trying to move, getting there slowly, but we are trying to move from the first box to the second. But really where we need to go, our destination is the last one, right? Where these barriers are completely broken. And a lot of what we are trying to do today is actually focused only on the second box. Right? You're able to see the difference? Right. So I want you to just keep this in mind as I talk a little more in the next few minutes, right? So this is population projection data, right? Because we haven't had the census. Just look at the number of young people in the ages of 15 to 24, right? Who are there 2021, 2026 and 2031. And Professor Jess showed us the data that there are about 26% of these. No, they are not of these. That's the point. Right? Who are these 26% who are actually in schools? In higher education institutions, right? Are they from these, are they 26% of these? And so, it's very important for us to actually imagine not just how many young people are in higher education institutions, but just think of the number of young people who are not in higher education institutions. And they're running into course. And I think when we talk about equity and inclusion, this is the big question. we have to put it in perspective. Right? So moving from 26% to 50% MBs at a target, great, but it's not enough. Right? So this is the second thing I want you to keep in mind as I'm sharing my experience. So I don't want to go too much into the physical parts of it because as Dr. Bhargavi has already laid the sort of contours of this discussion to the institutional and the curricular, but I just wanted to bring this data, right, which is basic stuff, basic thing, right? This is from, again, the All India Survey on Higher Education 2019-2020. Look at the number of institutions which have a separate toilet for disabled women. Look at the number of institutions that have ramps. Right? And this is from our data, this is government data. So there's definitely a lot to be done, even from a physical disability, just bringing equity and inclusion from that perspective. Right? So I'm going to tell you a small story. This boy's name is Ravi Jaiswal, and I've taken permission from Ravi to put this picture here. And it's fresh out of the oven because he's just reached the Institute of Development Studies at Sussex. It's a very, very famous institution which runs programs on development studies. And he was my student in 2017-2018. Ravi comes from a slum near Dharavi in Mumbai. He lost his father when he was about 8 years old. His mother brought him up. She was doing a lot of his domestic chores and household help work. And with great difficulty, she brought him up. She sent him to the local municipal school, and then he went on to do a bachelor's in social work in a very nondescript college. And then he was at a loss on what he should do because he'd had no skills, did not know language other than Marathi, and a spattering of English, and everything really looked quite bleak for him. And he just serendipitously applied to our program. And the kind of transformation that happened to him in 4 or 5 years, right, has taken him on a journey of lifelong learning, taken him into a space for higher education, but more importantly, it has given him the space to expand the work and the kinds of contributions he was making in the slums where he was living even as a young person. Right? So how do you improve life of people around me? How do I enable people to get their entitlements? How do I enable conversations with corporators, etc., etc. So he discovered what we are calling our, in the Indic systems we call it our swabhava, right? So he discovered his innate ability, and the process of unfolding that innate possibility through some of the things that we were able to do. And I'll come to that. But I just wanted you to sort of picture Ravi as I am telling you the other things that I want to talk about. Okay, so a lot of the things that Professor has already talked about and many people have been talking about, I just want to bring a couple of things into this conversation. One is that, see, in Ravi's case, for example, he just went for a degree and didn't know what to do next, right? And it's partly because he didn't know what the options were. And so if you're talking about equity and inclusion, how are we making information available to young people, right? About options available in higher education institutions. Is that the role of higher education institutions? To be able to tell young people, look, these are things that you can do, right? We haven't done that enough. obviously. So, what happens to people who go through a bachelor's degree, just because someone told me? It's a question we must ask ourselves. I just want to add on to the point that Professor was making about the Western perspective. Now, in the Western perspective, the parts are dissected, right? Whether it is physics or chemistry or whatever. Everything is broken down, you are analyzing the parts. Now, there is a difference in the way that we look at parts in India, or the Indic perspective, and the way that it is located within a larger synthesis, right? A larger cosmology, as I was saying. Now, this is something that makes it very difficult for a young person to make sense of what she is being taught in the class, because the perspective from which you come is a holistic perspective. And unless we are doing the bricolage, the bricolering that I was referring to earlier, enabling synthesis, right? Young people are getting lost. So if we are talking about curriculum and we are talking about equity and inclusion, how are we bringing this wholeness into the classroom, right? Cultural barriers, there are lots. All we need to do is go back and look at our textbooks, look at what's happening in our classroom processes, look at our institutional cultures. Huge number of cultural barriers. Language is just one of them, right? There are many others which make it very difficult for people coming from different backgrounds to assimilate into an academic institution which may have those barriers that we saw in that cartoon or picture earlier. Curriculum and pedagogy is very disconnected, right? And we all know that, right? If we just start examining our own books, where is the connect with reality, with experience of young people? And if that experience is not relatable, if what is being taught is not relatable to my everyday experience, right? How are we enabling equity and inclusion? It's just not possible. Language barrier we've already talked a lot about. I want to just talk a little about the pedagogy. I think a lot of the pedagogy is like what I'm doing right now, right? And just keep lecturing. You have a textbook, you're reading from the textbook, or you're just giving notes, and then there is always the guide and the kunji to go to. Now, this is problematic, right? Because if we are saying that learning has to happen, and there is intersectionality, right? Different types of inequities keep building on each other. So I don't know the language. The methodology of the classroom is different. I am sitting with a group of people that I'm unfamiliar with. The culture of the environment is so alien. Combined with, I'm sitting and listening to a lecture in a foreign language or in a language that I can't relate to. So it becomes extremely complex. And I think, therefore, that if we have to look at equity and inclusion, we need to re-examine our pedagogy. Right? How are we going to make it possible for young people to engage with learning, engage with content, right? What is that process? Right now it's very didactic. How do we convert it into some of the things, the dreams that NEP is talking about, right? That it should be discussion-based, it has to be more flexible, it has to have spaces for experiential learning, etc. Which is very different from what we do normally. And of course the technology dimension. And then I'm going to just quickly skip through some of these, but I want to come to this idea of multidisciplinarity, and I think you may have discussed it yesterday. Now I think that it's very, very important from an inclusion and equity perspective to look at multidisciplinarity and to be able to say, how do we enable this in our institutions? And I want to give you a few examples of that in a bit. So, even in terms of content, there is a need for us to examine our content and see how aligned it is with what the 21st century really needs. We live in a VUCA world, right? It's volatile, it's uncertain, it's complex, and it's ambiguous. In this VUCA world, what is the kind of content that is required for our young people? How can that be dynamic and therefore inclusive? So if you look at a recent report by the Department of Science and Technology on basic things like climate adaptability, it's a complex index they've created. There's about 60% of the country is going to be in really deep trouble on account of climate crisis. So the idea of content, right, within our curricula, which are looking at inclusion and equity and relevance, it becomes very, very critical. Also that, mental health is a big issue. And I was telling you that, I used to do a little bit of counseling as well. But mental health is something that we are seeing on campuses everywhere. And why has this become such a big issue? Right? It is, again, coming or stemming from our practice. How do we look at equity and inclusion? Who are these young people who are struggling? How do we take care of their well-being? And therefore, how are we enabling equitous environment, right, by providing support at 2-3 levels. One is the academic support, which the NEP is also talking about. It's also talking about counseling. And we have a dearth in our country of counselors. We don't have enough of them. We don't have enough psychologists. And so if every campus requires, right, to provide support of this kind, right, which is embracing every young person, right, how are we going to do that? And I did talk about a little bit about the transformation of pedagogy. NEP is also talking about special education zones. I know I'm keeping you from lunch, just bear with me for another 5 minutes. And that, is there a way in which we can do faculty development programs which are also having a focus on SDGs, which is not only about gender, like Sir was saying, but a whole lot of other things. And of course the institutional plans that we were also talking about earlier. What are the deliberate strategies that need to be integrated in institutional development plans for equity and inclusion? Assessment, I just wanted to place a few things for your sort of consideration and thought, which is that, assessments are currently very skewed. They are skewed towards written assessments, which are not equitable, right? If a young person is coming who doesn't have adequate writing skills, right, but has excellent oral skills, is able to make, we are an oral culture. Why are we dismissing oral assessment? So how are we going to enable assessments that are inclusive? Can we try some new things, right? Why aren't we looking at young people making videos to show what they've learned, right? They're very expressive. Let's give them that space. How are we looking at peer and self-assessment as valid ways of reflection and learning, especially for 21st century skills? How are we enabling our young people to get on lifelong journeys of learning if we don't embed reflection into assessment processes, right? So, it's very, very important for us to redesign some of these. I want to come to this research question, and I'm not going to look at my slides anymore because I want to make this point before we break for lunch. you know, the way that we look at research is extremely, I think we wear blinkers, right? There is value in looking at very structured research, but to be able to solve problems, and this is also related to pedagogy, how are we enabling young people to do action research, participatory research, that enables them to engage with complex problems, bringing in the theory that we are teaching in their classes, marrying it with their contexts, right, which will be very different. Contexts are very different. A tribal person, context is extremely different from Ravi's context, right? So how are we enabling that kind of knowledge creation, participatory research, solving complex problems in the real world? And how can we enable equity through this, right? And I think this is something that we have the opportunity to do now with the NEP because of the flexibility that is enabled within the policy. So can we think about the way that we would try and implement something like this, right? How do you look at students, faculty, communities coming together for research? The local knowledge, how can it get codified? Yeah? Before other people codify it and then there is an IP on it. It's our responsibility to do that, and it's possible to do it. So we have to sort of, the whole reimagination business that we were talking about in the earlier session needs to extend into looking at embracing equity and inclusion within this larger space, right? So really we are on this journey. And we are in the spaces in between. We are in the spaces in between. And over the next 10, 15, 20 years, is it going to take us that long? To be able to break down that fence which is there in the second picture. That is our duty. That is our dharma. How are we breaking down that fence which is in the second box? Thank you. Thank you for listening to me.
Thank you, ma'am, for sharing your perspectives and creating a reimagined outlook towards equity and inclusion. It's now time to thank our key speakers. I request Dr. Padmavati to kindly hand over the microphone as a token of our appreciation and gratitude.